So species are defined in a couple of different ways. There's a couple different types of species concept. First, you have Linnaeus. Linnaeus species concept was like the very basic definition. So the Linnaeus species concept would have been before there were like really good evidence for any of the like molecular or genetic stuff that we use today. So that Linnaeus species concept is like the very basics, and it's going to be based mostly on like body type, so what they look like, and then where they live and who they mate with. Do they mate with things that look the same? And then we have phylogenetic species concept and evolutionary species concept. And these two are very similar. The key definition here is that the phylogenetic is going to look just at that tree. So if you guys have ever seen a phylogeny, and we'll be talking a little bit more about that, I'm going to kind of, let me go ahead and Google it since I've got this shared so you guys can see what I'm talking about. We'll just Google that and hopefully there'll be a tree. All right, so when we talk about phylogenetic species concept on the tree, we're talking about the group whose members have a common ancestor and who all possess the same things. And what that means is they would be all at the same point on the tree. They all possess the same characteristics. So here we have, you know, leopards and domestic cats cannot interbreed. Those domestic cats on that branch, they share a common ancestor. So they came from this common feline ancestor, and they have all the same traits, okay? So that is your phylogenetic species concept. And then if you look at your evolutionary species concept, it's kind of the same thing. It's a lineage that is evolving separately from others. The only difference is this evolutionary species concept doesn't take into account that common ancestor as much. So in the phylogenetic species concept, they're worried about that common ancestor because that means that the animals have this genetic history together, that this is one group, one species. In the evolutionary species concept, you see it was created a little bit earlier than phylogenetic, I think. It's a pretty old concept for these species concepts, but they didn't really think about all of those details yet. They were looking at just the basics. So it was looking at that it is a lineage that evolved separately from others, okay? Both of those concepts, you'll notice, are, when I search for them on images, you see the same kind of pictures, which is why I wanted to show you that, because they're both very similar. The difference is that we're looking at just the endpoint on the evolutionary species concept, not the ancestor as well. All right, so molecular taxonomy is the practice today where we're actually doing like research in order to figure out where these species fit. One of my good friends, Kevin Kosat, he went to grad school with, like we went to grad school together, and he's been working, this is what he works on. I was hoping I could find one of the images really quick. But he does a lot of this molecular research. Let's see if I just search images. Yeah, here are some of his images. So he does research on the molecular stuff. Can I open the image so we can actually see it big? There we go. So it's got lots and lots of different names. I love the little rainbow colors he used on this one. So he has the like reds are all one group, the oranges are all this other group that have the common ancestor here. But he does a lot of work on that using the DNA, so finding DNA sequences and putting them together on these trees. This has seen a little bit of like shifting of understanding of organisms that we don't understand super well. So he in particular works on like brittle stars that live in Antarctica and like deep sea organisms and invertebrates. The same thing has been seen in like bacteria because we don't know as much about them. Things like mammals, we don't see the understanding shifting as much because they've been studied for a long time. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah, people care about the cute furry things. so we know more about them. And when we're talking about these marine worms, not as many people care. But that is molecular taxonomy. That's using the molecular genetics or sometimes proteomics. So genomics is looking at the genes. Proteomics looks at the proteins that they make and creating those phylogenies, those family trees. And then genome, remember, that is all of the genes in an organism. When we are doing this molecular taxonomy, often we're looking at the genes that don't code for things because those are the places that change the most. If I'm talking about a gene that codes for example, actin, all of your cells need actin in order to like be the right shape. The same thing is said for the cells of the trees outside my window. If there's any birds out there, the poor dead wasp that stuck to the ceiling in my classroom who got fogged with the Clorox fog. All of these organisms have cells that require actin to form the cytoskeleton in the cell. Because of that, if we use the gene for actin to tell the difference between like different species, we're not going to be able to, because everybody needs actin that works. When we look at this genome, we're actually looking at the like junk DNA that is like not for coding, because that DNA can change quickly. We can, if we make mistakes in it, it changes a lot. All right, any questions on that? That makes kind of sense? Okay.
You said it was actin?
Yeah, that was the example I used, was actin, A-C-T-I-N.
Okay.
The same thing could be said for like any protein that your cells or the cells of many things need. For example, if we were looking at insect phylogeny, my 3-year-old is super into bugs right now. They all have the protein or the carbohydrate chitin. So instructions for making this chitin would be the same throughout most of the insects. So the like proteins that are used to form chitin wouldn't change very much.
So
All right. Yeah, go ahead. Who said something?
I kind of missed the part that where you were talking about Carlos Linnaeus.
Carlos Linnaeus is just the first guy who described different species, and so he was like basing the species concept on what they looked like. So do cats and dogs look the same, and who they mated with.
Okay.
So his species concept is like the basics. The reason we still talk about him today, even though he didn't have a lot of the details, is because that's where we get the binomial nomenclature.
Oh,
so
okay.
You guys have heard Homo sapiens, that's humans. He created that two-name system, the genus and the species. Like ratus, that's a rat, that kind of thing. All right, so how many species are there? There's a lot of biodiversity near the equator where it's warm. Terrestrial biodiversity tends to be greatest near the equator. And a lot of that is because of the warm temperatures and high primary productivity. Plants tend to grow faster and year-round in places that are warm. And knowing just that, we know that biodiversity is not distributed evenly. So there is going to be more diversity in areas like the rainforest than there are in places like the desert. That doesn't mean that like the desert or the tundra is bad. It just doesn't have the same level of biodiversity. There's 1.7 million species that we know of. Based on new research, the number is probably between 3 to 50 million. And the reason there's such a vast difference in that is it's hard for us to know how many species of bacteria we are missing. Because when we try to study bacteria, we try to grow them in the lab, and some bacteria just don't grow in a lab situation. For example, bacteria that live in the gut of ruminants like cows, those kinds of animals, they're not going to grow very well in the lab. Some soil bacteria are hard to grow in the lab. They can't grow them alone, and so if you can't grow them alone, it's harder to determine how many there are. Nowadays, we're doing something called ecological molecular biology, where they're going in and like just taking the dirt and sequencing all the genes and finding all of these different bacteria gene codes. But again, it's hard to say how many species there are because we don't know how many we're missing. 65% of all the known species are invertebrates. So these are things without a backbone. And that's going to include like your insects, bacteria, all of those things. Endangered species are listed by the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources. If you want to see a list of endangered species, you can Google IUCN Red List, and it will give you information about those species. So I'll kind of just show you that really quick. So if you click on the IUCNRedList.org, it's going to give you information on which types of species are threatened, and then you can get information on different species too at that site. Oh, that's a really cute snail. All right. And last thing I want to talk about today is biodiversity hotspots. So a hotspot is a biogeographic region with lots more biodiversity than other areas. For example, forests tend to be biodiversity hotspots, especially rainforests, because they have more biodiversity usually than the grassland because there's more primary productivity. Brazil's Atlantic forest contains roughly 20,000 plant species and 1,300 vertebrates and tons of insects. They haven't even discovered all the different insect species there. So about half of those insects, half of those plants, half of those vertebrates occur nowhere else. So they are only found there. Colombia is considered to be very high biodiversity, a biodiversity hotspot. Highest rate of species by area worldwide. Has the largest number of endemic species, which are species that are found there and nowhere else. Costa Rica is another great example, although Costa Rica is doing a really great job protecting that biodiversity. Costa Rica has designated tons of the land space to be like conservation zones. So Costa Rica is doing a really good job. The other thing about that is that Costa Rica gets a lot of money from biodiversity. It has a lot of ecotourism, so people coming in to appreciate it. Because of that, they want to protect it even more. About 10% of the species on Earth can be found in Colombia. So that's 1,900 species of birds. That's more birds than in Europe and North America combined. So tons of diversity in birds in Colombia. Also 10% of the world's mammals, 14% of amphibians, and 18% of birds. So reading that, you might be like, well, that sounds amazing. The only problem is a lot of times this biodiversity can be in areas where you have civil and social unrest, and then there's not as much protection happening. All right, so here are biodiversity hotspots. We've got tons of hotspots in Central America. Almost all of Central America is a hotspot. And then we have the islands here. We've got areas in Brazil, around the Mediterranean, but not Northern Europe. And then, I'm not sure what the difference is between the blue. I think those are just the lower numbers maybe. But there are some hotspots in like the Japanese islands, and a lot of these islands, especially like Madagascar, are going to have those biodiversity hotspots. The one thing that I think students are often like surprised about is Australia, because they know that Australia is the one place where you can find like kangaroos and marsupials, but it's not usually considered a biodiversity hotspot because it only has a couple of those kind of groups that are endemic to Australia. So there's only really one area in Australia here that would be considered a hotspot. Most of Australia, like the inside of that continent, is desert. So they don't have as much biodiversity there. All right, any questions?
So you were talking about Costa Rica, and you said it was so did you say that it had a high number of endemic species, or were you using it as just an example for ecotourism?
So Costa Rica doesn't necessarily have as many endemic species as like Colombia. It's just a good example because of ecotourism. So it's using that biodiversity hotspot and all of that diversity to attract tourists and bring in money for conservation. All right. Well, that is all we're going to cover today. We're going to start back up with the benefits of biodiversity next time, but I'm